Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time. Don sitting in the host chair today. Happen to be joined by, I see it on my screen here, and this will make a lot of sense later at some point to our listeners. Chris Coppola joining me, who now has taken on, in addition to show agitator, the position of cartographer. And I'm just going to leave that out there, Chris, and not even explain what it is.
Yeah. That's how we're going to do it.
That's how we're going to roll.
At one point, I do want to restart our Kickstarter campaign to get me elected Holy Roman Emperor. We did try and do that for a while too. Yeah,
I'm in favor of that. We can put a new page on the website for that. So I'll go ahead and make the plug now for www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Go and contribute your Holy Roman Emperor campaign funds to Chris's campaign. So that he can also pick up the HRE title in addition to agitator and cartographer. So you already heard his voice, Chris. Good to have you for the episode again today. And what our listeners don't realize is how much fun you and I have talking off podcast about all kinds of wacky stuff. And we were just, I'll drop this little nugget. We did talk off podcast here. I need to get Alexis's approval on this because she still has her say, but we know where we're going in November already.
We know where we want to be in November. Just don't ask about anything in between now and then.
Exactly. But we spent about 30 minutes talking about the November series scenarios. So again, while I'm dropping breadcrumbs that you have to pick up that you don't know where they're leading, we have Chris in the role of show cartographer, and we're hinting about what the series is going to be in November. Neither of these things have to do with the topic of what we're going to do today. So what we are going to do today, I'll just, again, pulling the curtain back for our listeners. We are recording here on June the 6th. This episode will release later this week, so it'll have a pretty short turnaround. But if we'd really been on our game, we might have done this episode and had it released for yesterday, or the day before, even more importantly, on the 4th, ahead of June the 6th. But as we were talking about a topic to do here, that's sort of a filler topic, because we have so many of these things that are in the can and being prepared that are coming soon. This is, I think, our last episode where we have to tread water a little bit about something. Is Chris said, you know what today is? And I said, well, of course, it's June the 6th, which means it's D-Day. And I was actually looking this morning, Chris, just so you know, that is one of our most popular episodes in terms of the number of downloads. It, for whatever reason, given the amount of time that it's existed out there, it was early on in the show, it's one of those outliers when you look at the data. I think a lot of that has to do with most of our military episodes tend to draw a little bit more of an audience. That's one of the trends that's there. And then certainly things that people might search, like D-Day, or I mentioned Protestant Wind before, that relates to the Armada, things like that. So we're going to do a little bit of a take, not on D-Day, but our take today is going to be on something that is sort of related, obviously, to World War II operations, and it's going to be related around these dates. So, Chris, do you want to tease our listeners a little bit with the before the break tease about the sort of historical what did that we're going to play, and then turn it into a historical what if?
So this is going to deal with, this is another of those things we talked about off podcast, is the idea of things occurring in the same temporal space that kind of influence each other, that, it just so happens, and sometimes they're completely random and sometimes they're not, but they just so happen to happen a day or two apart. And so today's episode is about somebody who made what might have been a pretty stupid decision trying to get glory, and then D-Day happens and nobody remembers anything about it.
Right. And so I think that teases well enough that maybe listeners will stick through the break and they'll come back after that to see what we're actually talking about. So we'll invite you to do that after the break here. Come back while Chris and I look at the historical what if of something around June 6th-ish. I'll just leave it that way. Fair enough?
Sure.
All right. See you in a bit. Taking just a quick break from the podcast here. It's Dodd.
Alexis.
And we're talking to you today about something that we both use and we both enjoy. And that is going to be what, Lex?
That's going to be Audible.
Audible. I've been using Audible. I was actually trying to think of this the other day, Lex. I think I've actually been using Audible now for almost 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. Says something about my age, but also says something about how Audible has had sticking power. Because what Audible does is they are, I think, the leading provider of audio of all types of genres and all types of means on any device you want to listen to that audio on. So typically I think of that as being an audio book. But that's not the only thing, right, Lex?
Oh, no. They have podcasts. They have theatrical productions. Audible has tons, thousands of things you could listen to.
Yeah, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions. And so we are both Audible users. In fact, I jokingly tell folks that I work with and that I talk to in my other life, my real life, all the time, that I'm pretty much now about the only way that I read is to be read to, no strain on the eyes. And I can do that very easily with Audible. So we have a special offer for A Fork in Time listeners. You can follow the link in the show notes or go to audibletrial.com/aforkintime, and you'll be able to take advantage of a free month, one free month. And what comes with that free month, Lex?
A free audio download.
Yeah, free audio download. It's easy to say audiobook, and
I almost did.
And you may choose an audiobook, but it could also be, as Alexa said, there's all types of audio that can be found there. This is unabridged audio. It's a wide variety of fiction and nonfiction. They're associated with Amazon, which means one of the things that happens if you take advantage of the free offer and you happen to be a Prime member, you get not one, but
2 credits.
2 credits towards Audible programs for that first month. Of course, there is a cost after the first month free trial, but it enables you to try the service to see if it's something that you'll like. You keep those titles forever. By the way, they allow you to return titles that you don't like or don't listen to. I have found them to be both on a customer service aspect as well as just a service to use aspect. One of my favorite things. Alexis and I both at various points in our professional lives have traveled a lot.
Yeah.
And what you sometimes think of Audible as the road trip companion, right?
Yeah. Before I left on a trip, make sure you have an audiobook.
Yeah. And the cool thing there is you can do bookmarks, you can put notes, all the things you would want to do. So if you've been thinking about getting into audiobooks or audio materials of any type, we would certainly recommend Audible. And again, if you follow the links in the show notes or go as we described there to audibletrial.com/aforkintime, we get the credit for sending you there. You get the good stuff that Audible is, so we certainly would appreciate it. Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. The next voice you hear will be that of Chris Coppola saying, "How you doing?"
How you doing?
There you go. Chris, of course, a valuable part of the podcast here as a contributor and one of the he's part of the brain trust. I use that term incredibly loosely when it comes to A Fork in Time, primarily because of me, but a big part of what we've grown to here as a show. Today, the topic, as we talked about before the break, is going to center around World War II. And it's going to center around a what if that centers around World War II. And I was confessing, we use that term off podcast. I was confessing as we were talking about this. I think of myself as being a pretty good student of U.S. history, certainly U.S. military history, certainly World War II history. Certainly the big picture, the big sweep stuff, without a doubt. I can get lost a little bit in the details from time to time, but I will very quickly tell you, because you asked me for a date and I stumbled around and couldn't even give it to you. I struggle with the actions of what I guess loosely might be called the Italian campaign by the Allies during World War II. When we think about the war in Europe, or I think about the war against the German Italian part of the Axis, I think about Operation Torch. So I think about North Africa. I certainly think about Overlord and the landing there on D-Day, and I think about I think about the Battle of the Bulge. I think about all these things. I don't really think much about the Italian campaign. Certainly familiar with Anzio as an important landmark event in World War II, but I don't think about the Italian campaign as much. I think it sadly probably gets a second seat for a lot of people historically when it comes to U.S. military history of what went on in Europe. Would you agree with that, Chris?
I absolutely would, and I feel like one of the things you actually mentioned this in our discussions. One of the things is the movies. If you look at movie references to this entire theater, you've probably got Catch 22 some. You've got for those of you that remember Audie Murphy to Hell and Back, that takes place there. And then you've got the Sicilian campaign part of Patton.
Right.
And that's what people know about. That's literally what you were referencing was Patton and Montgomery in Sicily. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was an important part of the war. We were actually talking about something that relates to. I'm sure that we'll circle back around to when we get into what if here. Um, um, Political figures that we know participated in this part of the campaign. Obviously, it was an important part of the effort. The nature of how Italy falls. In fact, your question to me was, which is the first of the Axis capitals to fall? Well, that's it's Rome. Easy for me, it's Rome. But then, okay, when was that? Placing that in order becomes an important part of that. So I think it is an overlooked theater. And as a result of that, I think this is a very interesting historical what if, because like you said, the timing, it's one of these temporal things. I think we talked about this. I don't remember if this was off podcast or actually on an episode about a month back. The timing between Gettysburg and Vicksburg, for example, during the American Civil War is a good example of that temporal thing that's going on the same time. That's a really important resonance type of piece that's going on when you actually know the history there. To me, this actually screams a little bit of that in a way. It's that type of thing. We just don't pay as much attention to it.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons is because of the fork we're going to develop here. It could have been a lot more significant than it wound up being.
Right. I agree with that entirely. Is that I think very few people. It was obviously important to defeat the Italians as a member of the Axis. But if you were going to rank your Axis powers 1, 2, 3, Italy probably is always in the bronze position, right? To say the least.
Not to denigrate Hungary. Like at a certain point, you're talking about that level, and if I'm being perfectly honest, Italy might be top 3,
maybe,
but they might be relegated at times.
Yeah. And so, I think that's part of the reason why. And again, as you talked about, you think about movie portrayals or even just documentary portrayals. I mean, I was thinking about with this being the weekend of of the D-Day landing, Saving Private Ryan, The Longest Day. I mean, your list of Operation Overlord related movies is long. Even Patton, as we were talking about here, Patton's not even actually landing on D-Day, but he's important because he's part of the faux, intelligence effort to make the Germans believe that he is the guy that's leading this phantom thing that's, being used as a diversion. So just for the benefits of our listeners, this is also for my benefit too, because I've got to be refreshed as well, Chris. Let's talk about what actually happened in the Italian campaign with the Allies. How did that play out?
So this was, and I'm going to, this is another of those episodes where I come in and I'm going to take a pretty wider berth when it comes to the what did, just because I come out of left field with some stuff and I know it. So basically after, early 1943, the Western Allies have finally driven the Germans out of North Africa and are sitting there trying to figure out what to do next. And the Americans are pushing dead ahead, trying to send troops directly across the channel into France in mid-43. The Russians think that's a wonderful idea because that will scare the Germans enough to come over there and take some pressure off of what is going to become Kursk right around this time. If we're talking about that, this is happening at the same time as the Battle of Kursk, but the British basically convince the Western Allies that they need to take on the soft underbelly. The soft underbelly of the Axis is Italy. First, by taking the island of Sicily, which, as cartographer, I can say that's the ball that is being kicked by Italy and has been for thousands of years. That's, takes place in July 1943, same time as Kursk. And then in September of 43, they land in Salerno, Naples area, and the British land in the toe of Italy. They meet up and they start driving north up the boot. By 1944, July 1944, they've hit what is called the Gustav Line, which is a string of German fortifications that, one thing about fighting on a peninsula is it's kind of hard to find a flank.
Right.
Um,
on land, anyway.
Yeah. Yes. Really good point. Really good setup for what does happen in July of 40 or in January of 44, because the Allies decide to try and land on the other side of this Gustav Line at a place called Anzio. They do land there. In the planning stages of it, I know this hasn't happened yet, but it's envisioned kind of like an Incheon.
Right.
If we're going to fast forward a little bit, we're going to land and we're going to be right by vital stuff. We're going to be able to cut across the peninsula, and we are going to scare the other side into just breaking and running. And it worked at Incheon, and it did not work at Anzio. What wound up happening is they landed maybe a division or two, didn't land enough people. This is one of those, we referenced Sicily, where you have your patent people who say that Montgomery, was stuffy and was not doing enough. You have your Montgomery people who say Patton was out being reckless. So you have these debates. Anzio has the exact same thing. You have, after the war, the German weighs in and says, you just didn't land with enough people. His name was Albert Kesselring. You have the Americans saying the British didn't provide enough naval support. The British saying the American commander wasn't aggressive enough. Everybody is pointing their fingers at everyone else, but the fact is, nothing gets done. So fast forward to May of 1944, and the Western Allies, and this is the interesting thing. One of the other interesting things about the Italian front, I do mean the Western Allies, because the operation I'm talking about here, Operation Diadem, wound up finally conquering Monte Cassino, which was the linchpin, which was the major fortress on the Gustav Line, holding the Allies south of, in southern Italy. The troops that successfully captured it were Polish. This was literally Polish troops who had been captured by the Soviets in 1939, had somehow, and I do mean somehow miraculously, survived that process, had gone through Central Asia, and once the Soviets go to war with the Germans, the Soviets started shipping them to the British in the Middle East, and that's how you had this Anders Corps. You had an entire corps of Polish troops that were fighting in Italy. So you had Polish, you had Anzacs, you had Indian troops, and this is really the United Nations were formed. The term United Nations initially applied to
This force.
the Allies. The Allies.
Right.
This is a United Nations. There are people from all over the world fighting this battle, and they wound up taking Monte Cassino. They're driving north, and finally, the United States had given enough troops to Anzio, and they break out from Anzio, and the Americans finally break out, and they're rushing to cut the main road north so that all of these tenacious German defenders turn into POWs. And what wound up happening is the commander of the American Corps, a man by the name of Mark Clark, decided to disobey the orders given by Alexander, the overall commander. And instead of cutting off these retreating Germans, he decided to just he wanted to be the first guy to Rome. He wanted to shower himself in the glory and pretend he was another Caesar marching down the road with people throwing rose petals and all these beautiful things. And the Germans were more than happy to let him do that because it let their entire army escape.
Right. And we're talking there about 7 divisions.
At least.
In fact, I was looking here, what I have up on the screen in front of me now are some of the counts of troop strength and casualties and losses, and the realization that there are, approximately speaking here, at least 7 to 8 times as many Germans that are defending the Italian peninsula as there are Italian army forces that are defending the peninsula.
It was a common joke that, at least in the invasion of Sicily, there were more Italians in American uniforms than there were in Italian uniforms.
Right.
But go ahead and give credit. My Papa Al was one of them.
There you go. And thank him for his service. And then I was looking here just actually at the number of Polish casualties. That was the other thing that actually jumped out at me. It's actually there were a lot of Polish casualties. I mean, it's
absolutely. So maybe we don't call it the Western Allies, but the non-Soviet Allies.
Exactly. So that sets up the what did pretty well. So we have the situation where the campaign becomes stalled. Again, the Anzio situation, and when it comes crucial time to do something that's, again, as you said, cutting off the path of retreat and doing what's there. Where we're going to take the historical what if here is, what if Mark Clark had actually followed his orders?
And there's one thing that we haven't finished it off. He actually wound up taking Rome June 4th.
June 4th. And remembering the actual timeline here, of course, we know, as we mentioned, we're recording on June 6th, which is, one of the dates that there's about 14 or 15 dates in history that are drilled into my head. June 6th is one of them, I think, appropriately so. Originally, though, D-Day would not have been on June 6th. The date that would have been drilled into my head would have been June 5th. The one-day delay, well documented, was because of a weather situation, and they delayed for one more day, which was, if you know the nature of that operation was dicey because of how you had to mobilize and guys at sea and all the things that went with that. You couldn't just sit in this waiting mode forever because of the way the plan was supposed to work, and bombardment and paratrooper actions and all of that. So June 4th is one day ahead of when it could have been. Instead, it's 2.
But yeah, basically, the entire Italian campaign gets kicked, disrupted, so that he could have headlines for one day.
Right. Because
the next day, news breaks of D-Day, and nobody, Italy goes back to being a sideshow.
Yeah, which is exactly the thing that we sort of let off with. They're talking about just how it's sort of the historical knowledge stepchild of Allied operations in Europe. That's part of the reason why it gets trumped in the headlines, and for obvious reasons, because of the importance of the landing there at Normandy. And so, that's how we get there. So our historical fork is going to be Mark Clark follows his orders and doesn't go looking for, as we pointed out here, that one day of glory in Rome, that short-lived and was also foolhardy.
I do have an appropriate quote. I'm just thinking now of, in his mind, what he must have been thinking about the conquering generals returning to Rome, and they would always ride down the street in a chariot with a slave holding a crown above them. And the slave was supposed to be telling them, all glory is fleeting.
Yeah, in fact, we mentioned it earlier, that particular thing, that's a whole line and quote in Patton, the movie Patton, where he talks about that. So yeah, all glory is fleeting. In this case, it was one day fleeting. So thinking through the historical what if, we talked about a couple of things off podcast, and I think we'll focus on several of those things. But one of the most intriguing things to focus on to me is there probably is not a tremendous difference here about the outcome of the conflict in Italy per se. That was decided either way, both ways. So really, we're talking here about most of the impact being on the remainder of the way the war gets prosecuted in Europe. And I'm going to focus a lot around, what difference does it make to bottle up, capture, or neutralize 7+ divisions, and also then the position that goes with that. So starting with that, what do you think is the most important element of the what if, Chris? If Clark follows orders and does what he should have done, what happens as a result of that?
Basically by September-ish, the Allies are in the Alps. Not a mean feat, not something easy to cross, but they've finished the conquest of Italy by then. Just looking at it geographically, north of Rome, you start getting a lot flatter. You start getting a lot more traditional, good, offensive fighting country instead of slogging over hills. So I think they're easily able to be on at least current borders within a couple of months. One of the things I mentioned was one of the other overlooked operations, which was something called Operation Dragoon, which was an American and Free French landing in Marseille in southern France area in August of 43. And that doesn't happen solely because it's no longer necessary.
Right.
Right.
And that, what we talked about off podcast, and I think the most important thing is that I always think about after, in many ways, it was inevitable that Germany was going to lose once there was an established foothold in France. If you couldn't push them back on the beaches at Normandy, eventually things got a little dicey around, the counteroffensive, around the Battle of the Bulge, but it's only, it's problematic. But I think at that point, no one is really concerned that, you're going to end up pushing them all the way back and have, Dunkirk 2 is not going to happen once it's established there. So in my mind, whether this is the right or the wrong way to think about it, I think of a countdown starts in terms of the defeat of Germany once the Allies are successfully landed at Normandy. How it's going to play out is important. And of course, the countdown becomes important. We've talked about this so many times, not just to get that part of the war over, focus forces back towards finishing off the Pacific theater, but the whole tension that's going on between your ally, but we're keeping a close eye on you in the form of the Soviet Union, and who's going to occupy what land and how, it's the race to Berlin concept is the way that I think about it in my head. And so one of the first places I go in this scenario is, how does this alter the race to Berlin? And I think we were talking about this before. Is there even a race to Berlin, or is there a race to someplace else?
I knowing what actually wound up happening, I think it's more of a race to the Elbe. Looking at what the decisions that had been made in Yalta, with one of the things Eisenhower decided, he's not going to spend American blood or Western soldiers to take over land that we're going to wind up giving back. So while some people are still thinking race to Berlin, he's just thinking, let's get to the agreed upon borders. But hey, let's throw this out there. Those borders weren't agreed upon yet.
Right.
They were agreed upon a good 6 months after what we're talking about. And the first place that I went was the Balkans. In the Balkans, you had Tito and his resistance in Yugoslavia. Even in our timeline, when you did not have any troops anywhere near him other than Soviet troops, he still in the post-war era is very independent of the Eastern Bloc. And I think if you have contact with him beforehand, it's even more so. I think that's very important in how this shapes up, how things happen after the shooting stops.
Right. And we also talked about this also a little bit off podcast. Maybe we should just record the off podcast, sometime. That may be an interesting thing just to throw up on our Patreon feed is just, just, hey, hear the pregame show, kind of thing. Because we talk about
director's commentary. I think that
Exactly.
might be an interesting, yeah.
Yeah, is something that we do there. But again, the concept that we were talking about a little bit there is that if you think about even where the Nazi strongholds were inside of Germany, you're talking about, as you mentioned, Bavaria. You're talking about it being more in the southern part of Germany than in the other parts of Germany, such that if you have, in this case, American and other Western allied forces that are already in the Alps that are closer to making a threat to that, does that even change the way that things work or thought about inside the German defense, or where can Hitler go that he feels safe to go to get away from the bombing and the other things that are happening there? It probably changes the dynamic of that to some degree.
I do think so. One of the fears that the Allies had was that the Germans would take to the hills. Those hills are Bavaria, and I think they had the Germans had done some planning, they had done some thinking, but they really didn't start doing anything to make that happen until, in our timeline, February of 45. If you have a front line in Tyrol and in Austria, you've got stocks, you've got troops, you've got the logistics to make something like that happen in that area. And so I think that's another possibility that you have. I'm reminded of one of the things you hear about American thinking about the war against Japan. After Hitler, there may not be the capacity to have an organized surrender. If you look at what happened after Hitler shot himself, you've got Himmler, who says, I'm now in charge. You've got Goering, who says, I'm in charge. You've got Dönitz, who actually was put in charge. You've got all of this confusion. Nobody knows who's now in a totalitarian system. Even if you have when the top guy dies by natural causes,
Right.
not is trapped in his Berlin bunker. There's a wonderful movie called The Death of Stalin, which is hilarious to watch, but things like that happen when the top guy dies and you don't know who's in charge. You don't know who orders are coming from. And in a situation like that, you could have had the Germans operation was called Werewolf. These were people that were going to take to the hills and basically bomb and snipe and have a guerrilla war. And Bavaria is good country for it.
Yeah,
and
it's tough. It's tough. The analogy that came to my mind, it's very different terrain, but mountain terrain just in general, whatever that mountain terrain is challenging. I was thinking about how difficult it has been in modern times with modern equipment, modern technology, for example, for both the Soviets and then the Russians and the United States to execute in Afghanistan, for example. It's a tough thing to do, to conduct military operations in mountainous terrain successfully. And if you're the defender of that terrain, you have tremendous natural, geographic, and topography benefits that come from that. And if you're defending your home territory, even more so.
Absolutely. So that kind of gets to the idea that, yeah, we'd have been able to get into the northern border there, but getting over it would have been a little harder.
Yeah. And I couldn't help but think, historically going back, anytime I'm thinking about actual foreign forces on the Italian continent, the Italian peninsula, I immediately go back to Hannibal in my head, as being someone who for 10 years basically, ran forces all over the peninsula. But the toughest part for him was actually getting there, in the sense of that's why coming over the Alps with elephants is the big deal. I mean, this natural topographical defensive position that exists there for Italy also works the other way around when you're trying to go through it to get into Germany and move further up. And so it's, topography matters. Any military person will tell you, high ground, low ground, flat ground, wet ground, all the things that go with that matter, but makes it even more challenging. What are some of the other big what ifs here, Chris, about Clark following orders and not taking his one day of glory in Rome?
So this was something I had talked about, and I think is really interesting. The Soviets are scared of getting cheated. They, one of the, I didn't mention this, but one of the big things, the reason we did the Italian campaign was because the Soviets are screaming for there to be Western troops on the continent of Europe as soon as possible, doing something, because we're talking about 7 divisions here that could have really changed the Italian front. The Soviets just launched Operation Bagration, which took out a German army group. In order of magnitude greater, thousands. I mean, it maybe 100 times greater. And now it looks like the Western Allies have just fast forwarded and they're on the border of Germany already. The Soviets at this point are about halfway through Poland. And one of the things I talked about is this is Operation Bagration. This was their offensive timed to kind of smash the Germans at the same time as the Allies landed in France, and they get right up to the gates of Warsaw, and they need to stop for a rest. They say they need to stop for a rest. They sit down on the other side of the river, on the other side of the Vistula from Warsaw, and just wait. They say they need to rest and refit and refuel. And what happens is they've already sent out propaganda saying, hey, we're coming, rise up, and we will drive out the Germans together. And the Polish Home Army listened to them. And what happened is the Russians sat on the other side of the Vistula and let the Germans have at them. They basically sat over there while the Germans raised. They did a good job of raising Warsaw in 39, but they finished the job in 44. And it's a really interesting comparison. Again, this episode is talking about things happening at the same time all over the world. At about the same time, the Allies have broken out from Normandy and they're driving across. And Eisenhower has basically said, we are not going anywhere near Paris because we are a tank force. We are a modern army. We are not going to get stuck fighting in a city, especially a city like Paris, which has, magnificent architecture. It is incalculably valuable. We don't want to have to be taking that block by block.
Right.
So the game plan for the Western Allies is we're going to bypass it and just keep going. The French resistance rises up in Paris, and that completely changes the American game plan, the Western game plan. They just decide, you know what? They've done it. We need to go there and support them. We need to go there and protect the city and take it, which is the complete opposite reaction as what the Soviets did. And I think if you had a successful Italian campaign, and again, this is happening at the exact same time. So at this point, you have the Allies driving into the area of Florence. We're not even up to Milan or Venice yet, but the Germans have collapsed in the Italian front. Maybe the Russians don't think they've got the luxury of the time to sit there and let the Germans do the work for them. Maybe they just go ahead and cross the Vistula and drive into Germany, saying, we need to get as much as we can now because, man, they're having some success and we might not be able to
Right.
Like I said, let the Germans do our dirty work.
And so again, if you change the timing of so many of these things, we're accustomed to what the timeline is. It doesn't take much to change the timing, to change the territory, and then, it's about the war. It's about ending the war, World War II. But as we all know, this eventually, very quickly, turns into what is going to be the post-war situation on the ground as allies become, well, enemy, not necessarily enemies, but people you're looking out at with a leery eye going, hey, what's going on with that over there?
Still co-members of the United Nations.
Exactly.
Let's say that.
And of course, the other thing we've talked about in other things is just the whole timing of European theater versus Pacific theater. One of the things that this just popped into my head, this is why I love sometimes doing episodes where we don't spend tons of time thinking about it for weeks ahead of time, is you end the war in Europe faster. How does that alter the war in the Pacific without chasing that rabbit here? That rabbit just ran across the trail, and now I'm curious to think about where that rabbit goes. We talked about it for other reasons, but do you end up eventually with, does that alter the use of an atomic weapon at some point? Do you change the timing of the actions in the Pacific? Are the Japanese more willing to surrender perhaps at some point because, they've seen what's happened in Europe? These are all things I don't know the answer to, but all interesting questions.
As a hot take, the one thing I'd say is this. One of the reasons that the United States did not, land the full massive troop counts at Anzio is because we did not have the landing craft. If you look at the history of World War II to a really interesting extent, Churchill's memoirs talk about this. They just didn't have enough specialized landing craft. There's a reason that the National World War II Museum is in New Orleans.
It's called Higgins boats, right?
Yes, and we just didn't have enough of them. So it gets almost to the point that Allied amphibious operations can't walk and chew gum at the same time. So we can have D-Day, and we finally got enough troops for that. Not even troops, we've got enough boats for that. Then we can swing south and have southern France. We've got enough boats for that. We are just trying to build up enough of those and also move our bases closer. If we're talking about what's happening in that summer of 44 is when the United States lands. July of 44 is when the United States lands in the Mariana Islands. So if you're looking at that, okay, in October-ish, 44, we land in the Philippines. So if you're talking about a place that, hey, you got a whole bunch more ground troops, okay, the Philippines are definitely something where that could play a role. But when you really look at it, you've got Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and that's it. I mean, those are the only two other major operations that might have been affected by this, and I don't think they are, because the landing ships finally made it over there to allow those.
Right. It literally is, material in the form of personnel is obviously an important thing, but it's material in terms of, as you say, landing craft, support craft, just the logistics. I mean, the thing that I'm always reminded of about, Eisenhower's brilliance probably as a commander is that he understood logistics probably as well as any. He understood how to keep a coalition of a lot of egos, balanced in such a way that you did that. It was, balancing Patton and Montgomery, not just looking at the movie portrayal of that. In the real life version of that was a challenge, right?
Sure.
But at the same time, also realizing that it's also about, you have to balance just the resources that you have logistically in such a way that it makes sense. And he was responsible in that case, according to Eisenhower, for command in the European theater. He's not responsible for what's happening in the Pacific.
Right.
That ain't his gig. And Yeah, that rabbit just ran across. I had to take it. What does that change? We think about the timing here about Europe, but if you change the timing in Europe, do you change the timing in the Pacific theater? I think for the reason you just said, probably not. It was going to be what it was going to be, and the idea that the Japanese would suddenly choose to surrender earlier. We've talked so much about the Japanese mindset. We've talked about Dan Carlin. I strongly recommend Supernova in the East for nobody who hasn't listened to that. It will help you understand the Pacific theater in World War II at a level that you ought to understand it. That Carlin brings some tremendous things to that. That theater was going to be what it was because of what it was. There is a relationship back to the European theater, but there's also not. It's the same war, but two different wars is the way that I've come to think about it now more in my head. Yes, it's all World War II, but it's two. Don't think of it as being the same thing. Yes, the participants are the same in the case of the United States and in case of the British, and mainly the United States, but it's not the same thing. So what else are we missing here on our what if anything, Chris, as we start to close it out?
Nothing particularly jumps. I mean, I think we've got some really interesting things that this could affect. And it the reason I liked this idea is it's kind of picking something that, I'm going to say historically literate person can honestly say I did not know much about, but coming up with this really plausible thing that could have really changed how things happened.
Yeah, and it's also the reminder too that the other thing that struck me when you suggested, and Chris suggested this is the topic, so let me give credit where credit is due, is that we often forget that there's the orders that come down from the top, from the command structure, whatever it is, but that what happens for good reasons and for bad reasons in war is the theater commanders do different things. And sometimes their choice to do something different, we look back on it in hindsight and go, that was brilliant. Then sometimes we look back on it in hindsight and go, what were you thinking? And, and it's not always the result of the outcome that determines whether something was that way. There are probably a lot of people who look at that and go, well, yeah, but we got to Rome. We took Rome. Yeah. There was a great photo op, kind of thing. And so on the one hand, you go, well, the historical what if is about those 7 divisions, which you might not even realize were in play to be captured or to be, prevented from turning into what they are. It's those sort of more subtle aspects of we didn't lose. The Allies didn't lose because of this decision, but did they win as big as they could have? And unlike a sporting event, the margin of victory in war and the timing of victory in war matters.
Yeah.
All W's are not created equal, I guess, is the point of that. And so thinking through that, I think, is an interesting thought there.
The last, we said this was going to be the closer, and I'm going to throw it out there. In the episode, probably my favorite episode, the one where we talk about the negated nukes. That was kind of a 3-headed.
Yeah.
That was a Cerberus episode. I was a 3-headed dog. Brant was on it, and he made the point of thinking about all of the Americans that might not have been around, and in this very specific instance, 2 United States senators,
right,
Daniel Inouye and presidential candidate Bob Dole, were severely wounded by these 7 divisions in what wound up being the Italian campaign. So, yeah, how does that not play out?
Yeah, and again, that goes back to, we've talked about this a number of times. You mentioned Brant. He and I have had those discussions both on podcast, off podcast, about what I call the big flow of history versus, sort of the great man or the influential figure of history. Bob Dole is a very substantial, not that Inouye was not, particularly, being Hawaiian, to actually be a senator from Hawaii and have as much influence as he did is a big thing. We forget that.
For as long as he was.
Right.
He was the first senator elected from it when it became a state, and he served into the 2000s.
Exactly. But, thinking about Dole, who obviously was an important figure in American politics for a number of different reasons, his role in the Senate, as a presidential candidate, other things that were out there. If he's not wounded, not to say that he would not have had a political career in Kansas, not to say that he wouldn't have been Bob Dole, but so much of what made Bob Dole was the fact that he was not just a veteran, but was a veteran that has sustained noticeable, visible injuries as a result of his service. I'm not saying that he would not have been elected. Again, I'm not saying you had to be a wounded vet to be him, but that's who he was, and that is part of what made him who he was. There's a certain amount of credibility that comes when you are bearing that wound on behalf of your country. That is a legitimate credibility that comes with it, that he carried it with dignity. I think with dignity and grace. Whether you agree with his politics or not as an individual, I think he was a dignified, graceful individual, and that matters. And like you say, if he's not wounded because of that, what's different? Well, maybe nothing, but maybe something. There's some other guy from Kansas we would know about, for better or for worse, as having been the senator from Kansas, other than Bob Dole. And that's a fair, interesting place to go. I think we forget about those things, and we had a whole discussion, I think, about this. I think there's a whole interesting thing to be talked about, was also in that just the number of political figures that could have died, maybe would not be, different things that happened during World War II. And same thing happens during every war, World War I, the American Civil War, just how things could have been different, with a little bit of change on the battlefield. So I think those are interesting things to talk about. So I'm glad you hit that at the end, because we had talked about that off podcast. Chris, as always, I enjoy putting an episode together with you. Again, we're going to tease our listeners here about, I think you're going to like November. We got a good series of shows lining up for November. And I know you're working on where you're going to be leading and doing some. There's actually going to be an episode of A Fork in Time that Don's voice is not going to be heard on, which is an good thing, because you're going to be doing an episode with one of our listeners who's come in with a suggestion. You guys are working on that, and that'll also explain the whole cartographer thing, but I'm not going to go there. I'm just going to drop that out there. But I also want to remind our listeners that aren't aware of this, we're working on some of the stuff that relates to this now. Two other things still going on. Recorded and put in the vault today, getting ready to release, is the first episode on the Patreon series for the Late Bronze Age collapse. That was an introduction to that with the episode 2 weeks ago, by the time listeners are listening to this. But the first episode, by the time this is released, the first episode will be there on the Patreon feed. So if you haven't gone to sign up to be one of our patrons there, to have access to that, that's going to be exclusively. Maybe one episode will bleed over to the main feed. We may do that. We haven't decided yet, but the bulk of that is going to be on the Patreon feed. So if you want to hear that series of episodes about the Late Bronze Age collapse, just remind you that that's over there. There'll be some notes in the show notes. We've actually set up a special patron support level that is specifically for folks who just want to come over and be part of the Patreon feed there. That will also expire when the series is over. So if you make the commitment to be a patron there, you're not making a long-term commitment. It's a chance for you to try it, experiment with it. You can choose to go with the regular Patreon route or that. So I just mentioned that. And then the other thing, of course, is The Room Where It Happened, which is going to premiere here in June, which is our second podcast. I'm excited about some of the things that are going on there. Had some reach out today with some folks related to that. So all of that's pulling together. Chris, anything you want to mention to the listeners that I haven't mentioned that they need to know about?
Not particularly.
All right, good deal. So I do want to say on this particular day, if you are an American, and even if you're not, I know we have non-American listeners, which is great. We appreciate the fact that we have a global audience. But I was thinking today, I was actually looking at on my bookcase is Brokaw's book about the Greatest Generation. I couldn't help but think today about June 6th. Chris, you mentioned that you had a relative that served in the war there. This will not go out on the date of D-Day, but we just had Memorial Day here recently. Just, again, for any of our folks that are listening that are veterans, be they U.S. veterans or other veterans who have served their nations around the world, thank you for that. I appreciate that. The freedom to do what we're doing here is a result of what you did. I just want to say thank you. All right. I'm going to close this out, Chris, unless you got anything else, but we know how we're supposed to close out. We're supposed to suggest to folks that if they encounter a fork in time, any idea what they ought to do?
Take it.
I think they should. All right. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.